for able to join us. Glad you're able to join us on this cool morning. I can hardly wait to hear the speakers, but I'm going to say a few things first, if you don't mind. The United Nations Association does these forums monthly, and we try to pick topics of interest to our board, to our members, a broader audience. And well, for one thing, we have another one coming up. And I'll see if I can just put this up here. This is the flyer for it. This is on Saturday, December 11th. That's our next forum. And this one will be jointly with the Milwaukee County Human Rights Commission and the City of Milwaukee Equal Rights Commission. And it's in honor of International Human Rights Day. That is in December, the International Declaration of Human Rights was signed. And so we always do an event. It will be virtual, and you can get the information on our website, which is unamilwaukee.org. And for that and all events. We also have an annual meeting coming up in January, which will have a program with it as well. If you'd like to join, of course, you can see the information about that on our website as well. We try to accentuate a connection of our work to the kind of greater context of what the United Nations is doing and people around the world. And so we have this little card here, which has the Sustainable Development Goals. And so let me just mention briefly some that I think apply to the one today. Actually, quite a few apply. And so obviously number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions is an important one. We certainly need peace in the city and in the country in regards to gun violence. But I think we'll talk about this with the speakers a little bit today. Some of the underlying causes also contribute to the gun violence. And so number 1 is no poverty. These are the short form of goals. Number 2 is zero hunger. Number 4 is quality education. 5 is gender equality. And some of the others may be more of a stretch to apply. Number 10 is reduced inequalities. There's a bunch. Basically, this is a United Nations thing that we in Milwaukee actually help contribute to. It kind of gives us a guideline, a roadmap for looking to how to build a better future. And so that's what we hope these forums do. So I'd now like to turn it over to Dan to say a few words about, well, acknowledging where we are and who we're in debt to for this beautiful land.
Good morning. I'm Dan O'Keefe. I'm the treasurer of the United Nations Association, and I'm the host of today's program. We, the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee, acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the shores of Michigamme, North America, largest system of freshwater lakes. The Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet here where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, Mohican, other Native nations remain. It's nice to see everybody here this morning. Our purpose in meeting, what prompted today's topic was a discussion among program committee last summer. One of the board members brought a copy of an editorial in a national magazine that discussed how the United States has 390 million guns, which on a per capita basis is twice what the world has for an average. So that prompted us to really give this issue more light. So our purpose today is to share more knowledge, help us all become better citizens, more knowledgeable as what the causes and consequences of gun violence are, and also some possible solutions. And that our goal is to not particularly advocate for one solution or another, but to just give them the light of day. Our first speaker is Deja Garner. She's the project equity director at the WAVE, Wisconsin Against Violence effort. Deja, would you like to step up?
And before you start, if everybody could mute, please, there's a little bit of background noise.
Thank you, Dan. So should I get started with the presentation? All righty. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am honored to be here to share some information about gun violence, but I, as many of you do, dream of a world where gun violence will no longer be an issue. So to get started today, I would like to share a personal story. So in high school, I was extremely close to someone that was a year younger than me. One day we were on the porch of her mom's house and her older sister came out. She greeted us and she was, older than us, but she was so friendly. She was so hilarious and witty that we spent hours and hours on that porch laughing with one another. As I started to spend more time with them, the older sister and I would always, hang out, become friends, and we became pretty close. Our bond got so tight that the younger sister would always say, "Don't forget, you were my friend first." And that would always make me laugh. But the older sister was just so wise that I was drawn to her conversation. And she always seemed to prepare me for life, even when I didn't realize it. I became the pro bono babysitter for their niece that stayed with them. This was such a regular occurrence that I spent the summer after high school with a car seat in my car. My two friends were so close that they acted like twin sisters, even though they were a few years apart. I couldn't imagine a world without the two of them by each other's side. I also couldn't imagine a world without the both of them. I always knew that both of my friends would go on to do great things. The younger sister told her older sister that she would start a skincare business and it would be featured in Vogue magazine one day. The younger sister graduated college and she did start her skincare business. The older sister also graduated college and she became a beloved preschool teacher. By this time, we weren't as close as we once were. Distance, naturally became a thing as we got older. But whenever we did see or talk to one another, it was like no time had passed at all. The younger sister is still successfully running her business, but in 2019, the older sister ended up somewhere that we never imagined she would be. She is in Wisconsin Memorial Park, which is a cemetery in Brookfield, Wisconsin. On March 18th, 2019, my friend, the older sister, was shot and killed by her abuser before he turned the gun on himself. She had filed a police report just days before, and there was a warrant out for his arrest. But before they could find him, he found her. She was hiding at her mother's house. Her mother found both bodies at her home. And once the crime scene had been cleared and I was finally able to get there, to help sort the pieces, the first thing, I got through this without this reaction yesterday, but I'm sorry. But the first thing that I noticed was the porch that held all of our memories, the porch that my friend, the older sister, stood on while laughing at me trying to cut their grass with their old broken lawnmower. The porch that we stood on, the porch that we stood on while we watched their niece ride her tricycle. This porch now became what I had to walk over to go into the house where my friend spent her final moments. Her mother doesn't live there anymore, and I helped her pack while she was moving. I could not understand how anybody was going to move forward. I couldn't understand how her sister would move forward, her mother would move forward, or even me. We all experienced the loss of a person who was the glue of their family, the wise one. Now, 2 years have passed, and I have had the honor of working every day to stop what took her life and the lives of so many others, and that is gun violence. I shared that particular story, but unfortunately, I could share about 20 more stories of its kind from my own personal experience. So what I'd like to do now is take a 10-second moment of silence for all of the victims of gun violence and their loved ones. Thank you. All right, I am going to share a presentation now, and I hope that I can figure out this technology. Oh, all right. Can everyone see this? Okay. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, I am here to talk about gun violence, specifically the solutions to gun violence. To provide a little bit of context, we know that our country has a deeply ingrained gun culture. Compared to other health issues, though, gun violence prevention is fairly new. It can be extremely difficult to make progress in this work, especially because there are so many people who work so hard against it. However, as the country continues to realize how devastating the effects of gun violence are, we are seeing some positive progress. With that said, data is still being developed, so we don't have all of the answers quite yet, but we do have enough information to recommend evidence-based solutions. Okay, so let's get started. If you take a map of the areas in the city of Milwaukee that experience the highest levels of interpersonal gun violence and a map of the areas that are most impoverished, you will find that they are nearly identical. What we know is that gun violence is the evidence that we can see of problems that we cannot see or that we have ignored. Many of our gun violence prevention organizations talk about root causes, and one diagram that you will see is often of a tree. So this diagram, it has access to guns on the top, and then at the roots, you'll see a bunch of underlying issues. I like this diagram about causes. So when we talk about solutions, I thought it might make sense to use a visual of a houseplant because plants represent life. I promise this is not science class, but go with me here. All right, so to keep houseplants alive, which many of us struggle with, it takes a lot of care, attention, and resources. When you have a houseplant, that has outgrown its pot, you give it a bigger pot. When you notice that one of the leaves is completely brown, you might trim it. Or if you notice that your plant is collecting a lot of dust, you might wipe it clean. But ultimately, the 4 basic things that most houseplants need are water, good soil, maybe a bit of sunlight, and love. In addition to being a resource, the soil, to me, is like the foundation or part of the environment that the plant grows in. Essentially, all of the nutrients are provided underneath the surface. It's one of the most critical parts of helping that plant thrive. For those of us who take care of plants, we know that it is really important to water the soil and not necessarily always the plant that we can see. What happens to a plant when you do not water it, or if the soil completely rots? It dies. The death of that plant is what we visually see, but the cause is not always evident. So let's talk about when a houseplant is just wilting or it is in the process of dying. What do? We may find that the roots are dry and the plant needs more water, also known as a resource. Or maybe we find that the soil has some issue that we can resolve before it's too late. So if we truly care about and love our plants, what do we do after we find the root of the problem? We fix it. We pour our time and resources into it. We check in every day to see how things are going. We make adjustments as needed, but we do everything we can to save the life of that plant. This is how I envision our approach to solving gun violence should be. We know that there are problems beyond what we can see, and we must do everything we can to stop people from dying. Now, some of you may be experts in the area of plants, and you may say, well, Deja, if you overwater a plant, it will also die. Good point. But consider this. One thing that does happen in some communities is the over-reliance on the criminal justice system to solve the issue of gun violence through over-policing and law enforcement. This is an example of a resource, but it can be compared to overwatering your plant. When you overwater a plant, you are also killing it. So is it still considered a helpful resource, or should we take a step back to reassess which resource the plant actually needs? One of the things that I want you to take away from this plant analogy is that water is not only a resource, but it is a channel. There are elements in water that help a plant grow. It is the reason why we don't water our houseplants with soda or even certain types of water. We have to find the perfect combination of things to channel through that water to ensure that we create a solid foundation in the soil. We have to stay attuned to anything that plant lacks. We have to provide it, and then we have to replicate what works. Here are two facts. America has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And Wisconsin is here just to see how we compare to not only the United States, but the rest of the world as well. Well, obviously that's not all of the countries in the world, but just to provide a visual here. Wisconsin also has the highest Black incarceration rate in the nation. The United States is also the country with the highest rates of gun violence of any other high-income country. Looking at those facts and looking at the way that we do policing across the country, it is evident that the solution lies outside of our criminal justice system. So what are we doing incorrectly? That's a great question that probably has more than one answer. So I realize that I have not provided a ton of concrete numbers, and I hope that doesn't take away from any of the stories that I've shared thus far, but just in case it does, let me give you a few more numbers to consider. So according to worldpopulationreview.com, the United States has the 7th highest GDP per capita in the world. Now that's a nice number, but let's look at how that money is divided a little bit more deeply. And what we'll actually be looking at are our poverty rates. So according to the census, there are 37.2 million people living in poverty in the United States. And here is how the census has labeled each demographic. So we see the Asian population with 8.2 or 8.1%, non-Hispanic white, 8.2%, Hispanic, 17%, Black, 19.5%. And the specific report that I used to get those numbers did not have the Native population represented, but I was able to find a community survey that the Census Bureau did that said that in 2016, at least, the poverty rate was 26%. So now we can take a look at a few gun violence statistics. So according to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence's website, firearm homicide rates are highest among Black people as compared to people of other racial and ethnic identities. Unintentional firearm deaths are highest among American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black Americans, followed by white Americans. Police-involved shootings disproportionately affect Black Americans and Hispanic Latino Americans. Black Americans are killed in police-involved shootings at more than twice the rate of white Americans, and Hispanic Latino Americans are killed by police-involved shootings at nearly twice the rate of white Americans. So the difference there is that for Black Americans, it's more than twice, and then for Hispanic Latino Americans, it's nearly twice. So let's consider this. The United States is the country with the highest rate of gun violence, or the highest rate of gun ownership per 100 people compared to the rest of the world. Sorry, that always trips me up because I'm like, I can't believe that. But again, the United States is the country with the highest rate of gun ownership per 100 people compared to the rest of the world. Again, these are just a few countries that are represented here, but if you do your own research, you will find, you will probably be surprised at the fact that this statistic is true. There are more guns in this country than there are people. What we found at a grassroots level is that two things are true. Stronger gun laws do save lives, and an adequate amount of community resources does too. Equitable laws and policies are tools for gun violence prevention, but they cannot get the job done alone. Strengthening communities and changing policy have to work with one another as complements. For so long, this country and its policies have worked against some communities, and in turn, these communities have become the ones that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. We have to look deeply into our past to dismantle the systems that we created at one point in our history that still negatively affect our communities hundreds of years later. For example, let's take a look at our Second Amendment. Its original intent was to keep Black people from owning or possessing guns. Fast forward till today, how did America create conditions that allow Black people to be so disproportionately impacted by both state-sanctioned violence and interpersonal gun violence? We abolished slavery, allowed Black people to vote, made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. Laws are constantly changing and evolving to make things legally better for people of color. But what happened with all of the attitudes that kept people oppressed for so long? They still exist. Black and brown communities have been depleted of their resources for years. While lots of things change, that fact remains the same. It is the constant in this equation. So if we look at gun violence prevention, focusing on providing adequate resources is the one thing that we have not tried with fidelity. So we have not been committed to that commitment. Although this year, we do see community-based gun violence prevention funding being allocated at the federal, state, and local levels. One of the solutions that we can prove helps the equitable provision of resources is the one solution, again, that we have not given enough time and attention to. Many times you will see community-based violence prevention organizations get funded, and if results aren't achieved right away, their funding gets cut. Meanwhile, at some points in some cities, police budgets increase and so does violence. What is the response then? More money towards law enforcement, even if policing in its current state has not proven to prevent or solve crimes in some cases. What I am trying to say here is that just like in our plant example, we have to try our best to find and fund the best combination of resources that would allow all people in this country to thrive. We have to use the evidence that we do have to advocate for solutions that make sense and have shown some positive progress in stopping gun violence. We then have to rethink the solutions that we have tried for decades and have not worked. One other thing that we know for sure is that gun violence is cyclical. The more gun violence that happens in a community, the more likely it is that that community will continue to experience gun violence. The trauma from violence-related incidents outlasts the incident by years and continues to have negative implications for those experiencing lasting trauma. We can also look at health statistics. I think Steve mentioned this earlier. We can also look at health statistics, education, housing, transportation, infrastructure, equitable employment, proximity to healthy food, equitable access to entertainment, business ownership, and so many other factors to determine that disparities in those particular areas also play a huge role in gun violence. Again, when you have communities that are highly impacted by racism, poverty, and a lack of resources, statistics have shown that it is highly likely for that community to have high levels of gun violence. Bringing all of this back home, if you look at some research reports that have come out, Wisconsin has been ranked as the worst state for racial equality, and Milwaukee has been ranked as the worst city for Black children in this country, at least for a time. So we cannot talk about the record-breaking amount of gun violence in Milwaukee unless we are also willing to talk about the record-breaking amount of disparity and inequity that exists. It is just not fair. You may be thinking to yourself, okay, she has talked about porches, plants, history, and inequity. You may be left wondering, what are some things that you can do specifically? Here are some ideas. You can share your stories, thoughts, and opinions on gun violence with your legislators. You can research and advocate for equitable gun laws, such as background checks on all gun sales and extreme risk protection orders. You can support your local gun violence prevention organizations. You can have conversations with your friends and families about the harms of gun violence in this country. You find ways to get involved with community-based direct service organizations. You can advocate for equitable resources for communities. You can dispel the false narrative that more guns make us safer. And finally, you can do self-work to try and reframe the way that you've looked at the causes and solutions to gun violence in this country. Oh yeah, and do you remember when I told you that my friend told her older sister that her skincare business would be featured in Vogue magazine one day? Yeah, so that her dream actually came true twice, and she was featured in Vogue magazine 2 times, but her big sister was unfortunately not there to see that dream come true. The reason why I sometimes shy away from running through lots of huge numbers is because real life stories can get lost in statistics. We honor the memories of our loved ones with action. So thank you all for listening, and thank you for demonstrating your passion for this issue by being here. I want you all to remember that gun violence prevention is an act of love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deja, for your concise and clear information. It's very thought-provoking. There will be questions at the end of our discussion after our next speaker, who is Tim Daly. He's a project director with the Joyce Foundation, which is a national foundation and think tank that brings together data, information on gun violence, and also funds those research as well. Tim will be informing us on as well on gun violence, and also to inform us on the more national implications of gun violence. So Tim, welcome.
Thanks,
aboard.
Dan. Yep. Thanks, Dan, for that invitation and introduction. And thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'll just flag that my cat decides to join me on most of my Zoom calls, so I'll do my very best to keep her to the side. Jerry and Deja have found ourselves in similar meetings, and so I think they've gotten a chance to meet Woodley in the past. So I apologize for that, but appreciate your all's focus on this issue this morning. And as Dan mentioned, my name is Tim Daly. I'm the director of the Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program at the Joyce Foundation. We are based in Chicago and primarily as a foundation focused on the Great Lakes region, specifically the upper Midwest Great Lakes region. But for our gun violence program, which has been around for a few decades now, we have had more national work and focus for the reasons Dan mentioned. And unfortunately, it's also because there haven't been a lot of funders in this space either. And so because of that, we have found ourselves working across many states outside of our region. So I was really excited to be asked to join you all today and share our thoughts and perspectives on these issues. And I'm really happy that I get to follow Deja, because I think she did a really incredible job outlining the scope of the issue in Wisconsin, and really that transcends the state borders, and how that experience is playing in most other states in the country too. And so the issue of gun violence, unfortunately, is not getting better. It's getting worse. And there are many reasons for that, a lot of which Deja, really went into in great detail. I think you can also add in the impact of the pandemic. And then there's also a couple of other structural reasons why that's happening, some intentional reasons. And so I was asked specifically to talk about, the effects of gun violence, what are some of the causes nationally, and then to transition that discussion into some of the solutions and way we can implement some of those. So let me try and jump through those quickly, and then we'll certainly leave plenty of time for questions, as Dan mentioned. So I won't bore you with all of the specific numbers that we see, but trust me when I say, as I said earlier, that gun deaths are going up, and this is true across just about all forms of gun violence. We've spent a lot of time this morning talking about homicides, and that really is one of the drivers of the increase. But this is also true for suicides, which represents about just under 2/3 of gun deaths in this country. And it's also true for accidental shootings as well, in addition to homicides, of course. And as Deja mentioned, the impact, especially amongst homicides, is very disproportionate towards specific communities, in our country. It's disproportionately Black men in particular, brown and Black men, but of course hits, all elements of our community. And when you compare gun deaths in this country to other forms of preventable death, unfortunately, gun violence continues to be either near or at the top of that list, and in fact, even surpassing vehicle deaths in recent years. So there, as Deja mentioned, we see the top line consequence, the death of individuals, and the harm of them. But what are the other consequences of gun violence in terms of its effects on our neighborhoods and in our policing and other consequences? I think a couple of things that are worth highlighting before we talk about the causes some more. Number one, is the physical and emotional distress after surviving and then perhaps living with gunshot wounds, whether that be you or someone in your family. The costs associated with that. It is expensive to have a funeral, for example. It is expensive to figure out childcare after the fact. And who is that falling upon? Again, if we're talking about the disproportionate impact of gun violence to Black men, as a result, Black women are often times then trying to figure out what to do with again, those expenses. And while there have been programs that have been set up at times, like things called VOCA, which is supposed to provide resources to victims of crime, there are so many obstacles and barriers to those programs that in many instances, those funds are just not being connected to those who need it. And then what also happens, there's a chilling effect on the aspirations of younger kids. There's hopelessness because gun crime in particular is not being solved. A lot of people talk about this in terms of clearance rates. And here in Chicago, the clearance rate is particularly bad. If you look at gun homicides, law enforcement is only clearing upwards of 20 to 25% of those cases. And so when you know that 75% of those cases are not being solved, then what does that mean in terms of people who live in that community? A sense of hopelessness definitely takes over. And it's also true that families are then not being treated fairly during those investigations. And the impact of that, again, is eroding trust in law enforcement and then furthers that cycle of violence that Deja was talking about earlier. So let's talk then quickly about the causes of gun violence. There's a couple that I want to talk about. But before we go into the individual elements, I do want to talk about the restraint on our understanding about the causes of gun violence. And that really is the lack of investment into research. As many on this call may be aware, that for the last 25 years, up until just very recently, the federal government was effectively prohibited or barred from researching causes, solutions, or policies into gun violence. And that was really for a political reason. Those that had a political and perhaps financial interest in selling more firearms were successful in limiting those funds and limiting research to be done. And the result was horrendous. We have not had nearly the research base to study this issue. And I apologize, one of my neighbors is doing some work in the yard, and I hope that's not too loud for you. If it is, just let me know and I can, okay, great, fantastic. So the impact of the restraint on research has meant that the research base was largely left to philanthropic organizations or researchers who were spending their own money to try and research these issues. The bottom line is we are hundreds of millions of dollars short in terms of the research that we need to fully understand this issue. Right now, the federal government is spending about $25 to $30 million a year on research, which is a change in the last 2 years. But in a recent study that we and Arnold Ventures, another philanthropic partner of ours, recently commissioned, we now believe the number to be about $125 million a year that needs to be spent in order to collect and analyze the data necessary to fully address the issue. So until we close that knowledge gap, a lot of what we talk about in terms of causes and solutions have some uncertainty. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue those things, but it does mean that we need to invest even more in those research elements. So again, what are the causes? Deja mentioned some of these already, but I'm going to run through some of them again, just for emphasis. Number one is just the volume of guns and the easy accessibility of guns in this country. The volume and accessibility of guns in this country impacts all forms of gun violence, full stop. Next paragraph, if you will. And if you compare our country, as Deja did, to other countries, there's no question and no wonder why we have more gun deaths in our country compared to every other in the world. It's because the volume of guns here exponentially surpasses others. And what we're also then seeing is that gulf is getting bigger. Over the pandemic, we have seen record sales of guns. In fact, 1 month will then be followed by a next in terms of the records that are being set. And so the number of guns, unfortunately, is increasing, not decreasing. So why is that? Well, part of it is because, gun manufacturers and those in the industry have a financial interest in selling more guns. Another key reason, and again, another cause for our increases in gun deaths in this country, is the growing misalignment between the perceived versus actual risk of firearm ownership and possession. So what do I mean by that? It used to be that people in this country owned firearms because they wanted it for sporting purposes. They wanted it because they wanted to go hunting. And in Wisconsin, you all are all too familiar with the ebbs and flows of hunting season and when that happens. And that was first and foremost the reason why most people own firearms. Today, that's not the case. Today, the reason why most people own firearms is because they believe they need it for self-defense for themselves, for their home, for their friends and their family. And why do they think that? Well, one, because they believe that a gun will make them safer. The research and the data couldn't be clearer in that sense. Owning and possessing a firearm makes you exponentially less safer. It makes you more likely to commit a successful act of suicide. It makes you more likely to succumb to an accidental shooting. It makes you much more likely to find yourself in a situation that you wouldn't be in otherwise. So then why are people misaligning those risks? Why are people perceiving it to be safer to own a firearm than not? Well, part of it is because of what the gun lobby is doing and the money that they are spending to try and convince you that you need a firearm. And the narratives that are developed, like what happened, in Kenosha, quite honestly, a year ago, where people believed that those activities that were happening was making them less safe, and therefore they needed to arm themselves. The other main reason why there's this gulf between the perceived and actual risk is related to many of the issues that Deja talked about earlier, which is this enormous lack of trust in law enforcement and other safeguards in our society. So I mentioned earlier about the clearance rate here in Chicago, where it's 20 to 25% on any given year. And if you live in a community where that's the case, people have said, yeah, you know what? I understand the actual risk of owning a firearm to myself, but I really have no belief that law enforcement or other elements of this community is going to protect me and my family. And I'm willing to take that risk. And that is happening increasingly across the country. And it's just driving a huge sales in guns, both legal and illegal. And when that increased volume of guns enters our community, it increased the risk for all the things that we talked about between suicide, accidental shootings, mass shootings, homicides, interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, all of the sort. And so until we correct and or find a way to address that misalignment in risks, we will have a very hard time actually addressing forms of gun violence in this country. And then aligned with that, I do want to just underscore two other things that Deja said, which is the underinvestment in communities. A lot of that, again, goes into that risk calculation when those underinvestments, whether it be housing, jobs, environment, education, and the sort, again, that underinvestment leads folks to change the calculation of risks. And again, also the lack of trust in law enforcement and accountability that we talked about. So what are the potential solutions? There are several that I think policymakers and communities should consider to address this in the short to medium term. Number one, we need policy change, and that's at the state and federal level. And we could talk for hours about what all of those specific policy changes could be, but it's fair to say that we have entered a period where making significant policy change in wide areas of this country has become almost impossible on this issue. And so we really do need federal policymakers to fill the gap. And we really do need to find a way to adjust state policymakers' views on this issue, because we simply need stronger policies on this issue. And what are the policies that they could include? Again, we could talk about them for a long time, but a couple to lead with is, first and foremost, coming up with better mechanisms to assess risk and restrict access to firearms based on risk. So one of those policies that have become popular in recent years, as Deja mentioned, the Extreme Risk Protection Order, which was a policy designed to be able to restrict a certain person's access to firearms if they are found to be a danger to themselves or others for a defined period of time. Again, that idea of restricting access specific to risk is a policy bucket that we think needs to be considered. Another that I want to lift up is then the effective regulation of the industry. For a variety of reasons, but primarily political, for the last 2+ decades, the firearms industry on the whole has largely been deregulated or unregulated in many respects. And this runs the gambit from immunity that they have been given with respect to potential liability. It also includes what federal agencies charged with actually regulating the industry are able to do, that being the ATF or the DOJ or otherwise. And the same is true at the state level. Until we effectively regulate the industry and regulate firearms, we are again going to be hard pressed to do much about it. The other potential solutions, a big bucket is about funding. And there are several elements that need to be funded in this issue area. First and foremost is research, right? It'll be hard to do something until we have definitive academic peer-reviewed research and evaluation that we can really use to persuade those who perhaps disagree with these options. We need to fund implementation and enforcement. And I am sensitive to what Deja said about over-enforcement in certain communities, and she is absolutely right about that. So when I say implementation enforcement, I am talking almost about what enforcement should be doing with respect to that terrible story that Deja led with, right? In that instance, and we see this playing out over and over again, that intimate partner violence is an example where implementation has fallen down, where a victim of domestic violence does everything right. She goes to the court. They get a protective order. That protective order is supposed to prevent dangerous people from having access to a firearm in that moment. And for a variety of reasons, the system breaks down. Perhaps the data isn't shared. Perhaps that information isn't then communicated and coordinated with law enforcement. Perhaps law enforcement hasn't prioritized or funded efforts to locate that person and dispossess that firearm from them. And that has happened time and time again across this country, across all types of gun violence. And that's what we mean by implementation enforcement. And lastly, on the funding bucket, as Deja mentioned, is a new focus on community violence intervention strategies. There just really hasn't been an investment in those programs. There have been some nominal ones, and there have been some efforts in recent time to direct some funds, but the programs on the whole still remain widely underfunded and widely under-researched and evaluated. The third is prioritization. Prioritization by policymakers and systems actors to implement. This is an issue that has become so challenging for police chiefs, for those responsible in that chain of events that we talked about in the domestic violence case, where they just aren't either able or not willing to prioritize the implementation of the issues and the actions that need to be taken. And the prioritization is one of the solutions that I think policymakers need to bring to the table. And then we need to reimagine public safety. And this takes many forms. This includes, police accountability and trying to understand the other alternative models of response, whether that be co-responder models. That means reallocation of resources and responses. It's not about defunding the police that, unfortunately has become the bumper sticker discussion of what, folks believe we mean when we say reimagining public safety, but it means about bringing a whole of government approach to reducing gun violence in a safe and fair and equitable way, because thus far that's not been the case. And we are learning more about co-responder models, for example. Why is it that law enforcement is the one who is being asked to respond to the vast share of mental health and distress calls when they are not clearly the best suited to do so? And they will readily admit. And until we adjust and think about what that whole of government approach is, again, we'll continue along these cycles of violence that we've talked about. So with that, I just ran through a ton of stuff in a really short amount of time, but I really, again, appreciate you inviting me and Deja and all of us together to talk about this important issue. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks, Tim. If Martha could help me identify people who are raising their hands or pressing the hand button, I can select the people who want to ask. And please address your questions to either Deja or Tim, if you like, and we'll see where it goes.
Sure, there's been some activity in the chat. If folks would like to address any of those comments or questions, but we do have a hand raised, and that is George.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Daly, for your wise observations. I was born and grew up in Chicago. Every kid in Chicago that I knew all about the gangster lore and the history of Chicago. But there's no better example, I think, of the need for federal legislation restricting access to firearms than Chicago. Because although Chicago has strict controls on guns in the city, the firearms flow in from the surrounding jurisdictions because they don't have, including the surrounding states, they don't have similarly strict gun laws. Therefore, we must have federal legislation to stem the flow of guns across jurisdictional boundaries. Can you comment on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, George, for the question. And you're absolutely right. We recently commissioned a couple of studies, one in 2014, another in 2017, to understand where crime guns were coming from that were being recovered in Chicago. And only 40% of crime guns, which is still a significant number, but only 40% of those crime guns recovered in Chicago were coming from gun dealers originally in the state of Illinois. That meant 60% were coming from out of state. And the number one contributor of those was the state of Indiana. Indiana, as you mentioned, has fairly weak gun laws. And so until that patchwork is addressed, until we figure out a way to raise that bar across all states, the weak gun states, the weak gun law states are going to feed crime guns into those that have strong gun laws. And yes, there are federal policies you can consider immediately about that. And this really does tie into that issue that we mentioned earlier about regulating of the gun industry, right? You know, part of the reason why you see that flow of illegal guns is because gun dealers, you know, well, I should say that every gun starts as a legal gun, right? Every gun is sold legally. And at some point along the way, it goes from a legal status to an illegal status, right? And why is that and when does that happen? Well, one of the drivers of when that happens is when gun dealers, specifically those that are perhaps not the best of actors, you know, are deliberately selling these guns to those folks that they know shouldn't have access to them, or perhaps they are selling them in bulk for their own, you know, private profit reasons, right? And again, that lack of regulation of the gun industry is providing a huge opening to drive that flow of illegal guns from those states that have poor gun laws to those states that have stronger gun laws, like in Illinois.
Great. Steve?
Thanks.
Yeah, I had a question actually for both of the speakers. To Deja and Tim, as far as anti-violence efforts to get some kind of funding, whether foundation or government, which ones have worked better? I was interested in the comment that they get cut off too soon if they're not producing results, but have some had enough time to produce results? And if so, what are their strategies or tactics? Which ones work if we have some evidence in that regard? To Tim, as far as research nationally, you mentioned it's sort of up to, well, outfits like you, philanthropies and so on. I wonder why universities who have, you know, some access to resources to do research have not done better on that. And then just lastly, Tim, on one thing you just said on every gun starts legally. Well, what about these ghost guns, and can we do something about those?
Thanks. Deja, do you want to go first on the different types of CVI programs?
Sure. So what we've seen a bunch of different models that are that have been tried and that we are currently trying to see get a little bit more widespread across the country are models that include violence interruptions or violence interruption or violence interrupters. And so basically there are programs where there are citizens who are not part of, you know, they work sometimes with law enforcement, but they are not part of the law enforcement system, but they are actually part of just like a violence prevention organization or like a subset. And so, for example, here in Milwaukee, we have the Office of Violence Prevention, and their violence interrupter program is called 414 Life. And so it's a program that's actually under the umbrella of the Milwaukee Health Department, which is probably, because gun violence is a public health issue, that's probably one of the better models to take, is to have gun violence prevention actually fall under that umbrella. But we've seen a lot of success with programs like that, where there are real life people who have real life experience going out and working within the communities, working with survivors, going to hospitals as soon as incidents happen, and really trying to do everything possible to deter violence from happening. And I might be a little bit biased, but also WAVE has been around for quite some time, the organization that I work for, and has worked tirelessly to achieve a bunch of things, not just on the legislative level, but also advocating for that community-based funding that we've talked about. And so we've seen a lot of success as far as being able to show up at the Capitol and get legislators to do something. And we've also seen success at the, again, federal, state, and local levels, where we've been, us and our supporters have been mobilized to try to get people who make decisions to allocate more funding to community-based, resources. There are also hospital-based violence intervention programs. There are a ton of models that are new, but are being tried again widespread across the country. And honestly, one more thing, and then I'll wrap it up. There have always been really small gun violence prevention movements in communities for years. But a lot of those really small organizations, maybe they don't have that 501c status or C3, 501c3 status, or maybe they aren't officially incorporated as an organization, but there are lots of people who have put in work and effort for years to interrupt violence, and they just don't get the funding or attention that we would see that some other organizations get. So there's kind of a lot to it. It gets a little bit kind of complicated when we talk about who's considered an organization or not, but we have definitely seen a lot of progress with organizations that are actually on the ground, boots on the ground, working directly in communities.
Yeah, it's a great survey, Deja, and I just dropped in the chat a link that from the Giffords Law Center that they put together various reports on things, and one of them was kind of a survey of many of the strategies that Deja just went through for your reference. And I think we're starting to see some research, we're starting to see some evaluation of those strategies. I think one in particular that we've seen is a group called Advanced Peace. Another is a type of focused deterrence like a GVI, group violence intervention type model. Some people refer to a version of that as called cure violence. The thing is with these strategies is, it's not like a one size fits all, right? Each of these strategies applies to very specific circumstances. And I think that's why it's been, hard for a program to be put at scale and then evaluated fully, because there is intense cost with that. And as Deja mentioned, they've just been underfunded. I think one thing that we will find out within the next 2 to 3 years is we will learn a lot more about the research of these projects. And that's really gonna be for 2 reasons. Number one, more and more states and communities are dedicating a portion of their stimulus dollars, the American Recovery Plan Act dollars, towards these strategies. And as a result, there will be more, opportunity to research. And then some of that money either through ARP or alternatively through some of the money, and this is the second bucket, some of the money that may be coming down from the budget reconciliation, plan that Congress is still grappling with. There would be perhaps a surge of funding, upwards of $5 billion directed towards CVI projects. And when that money is spent, it would be required to be evaluated. There would be some money earmarked for research. So I think we will learn a lot more about that. So to your second question about researchers, and then maybe why didn't academics or academic institutions prioritize the potential research in the absence of federal funding? I think a couple of things. Number one, the academic institutions need federal funding, right? These folks, unfortunately, is a very money-driven enterprise, and the time for all those academics is so carefully managed that if they don't have specific funding to do the research, then they just unfortunately can't prioritize it. But there have been some instances where some people would still want to do the research. But one of the problems that they would run into is that they didn't have all the other folks that they needed to do that research. They didn't have the postdoc students. They didn't have others. And why was that? Because there was a chilling effect from the lack of federal investment. There was almost like a stigma associated with researching guns, right? And as a result, generations of new researchers decided to go apply their trades to other issues. And as a result, the bench of researchers got really, really thin. Now, they have tried, the research community, through our funding, through Arnold Ventures and from others, tried to be innovative to still keep that going. And there were some researchers who put in their own dime. A researcher out at University of California at Davis very famously put in literally his own family's money to continue some of this research. But those were the exception, not the rule. And as a result, the base of research really got pretty thin. And your final question about ghost guns, you're absolutely right. This is a growing problem, and it's a growing problem in certain parts of the country, especially. And in California is probably the biggest source of these ghost guns. And for those that are less familiar, these are guns that are literally constructed through parts that are maybe available on the street. They are, gun manufacturers will sell like revolvers that are 80% completed. And that's the standard that ATF has had on the street, if you will, that if a gun is less than 80% complete, it's not considered a gun. It is parts, right? And so people would literally buy these components, put them together. They wouldn't have a serial number. They wouldn't go through the normal commerce and therefore the various, safety checks and whatnot. And so these then became known as ghost guns. And that is becoming a problem, especially as manufacturers are now intentionally and deliberately, building and selling those parts. I mean, it needs to be addressed. A number of states have started to make those things illegal. In Pennsylvania, for example, the Attorney General has dedicated a new unit within his office that is focused on cracking down, on exactly this. But again, we need a federal policy here to deal with this if they're really going to make a dent and prevent these ghost guns from taking over.
Deja, can you tell us a bit more about what WAVE does here in Milwaukee? I'm also interested in the community-based programs. We have a little bit more detail of who comprises the working group and what they do.
Sure. So, well, I think to provide some additional context about WAVE as an organization. So I look at our work in almost two different parts, right? So a lot of times we will provide, education. It's an educational fund. So we try to provide a lot of information and resources to people so that they can then make informed decisions. One of the things that we try to shy away from is any type of conversation around like we should just get rid of all guns or we want to take all of your guns or anything like that. A lot of people have that perception of gun violence prevention organizations is that we, kind of come in and want to completely dismantle the Second Amendment and all of that. And I'm pretty sure that, people on the call have their own opinions about that. But really it's about providing people with the statistics and the research and the information that they need to make informed decisions to keep themselves safe and to keep their families safe. So that's one part of it. Then the next part is really that focus on the policy aspect of it. That's one thing that we've really been trying to hone in on is equitable gun violence prevention policy. And so when we say equitable, that piece is really, really key because what we see, and as I mentioned before, our incarceration rate and our carceral footprint is already huge. And so a lot of times when we put out these laws, we look back over the years after, the laws have been passed and we realize that certain communities have been disproportionately impacted by those laws, right? And so as an organization, we have been really trying to do a ton of research around what equity means for gun violence prevention and how that can apply to policymaking, and then taking all of what we're learning and sharing that with our supporters in addition to legislators. And then I would say, another piece of it would be the action piece of it. Now with COVID, that gets a little bit, more complicated, but over the years, WAVE has done, again, a bunch of mobilization of people to actually take part in different pieces of action. And so, for example, just this past Tuesday, we had a really huge lobby day where we got a bunch of people together on two separate calls, and we invited a ton of legislators for their constituents to really let legislators know exactly what's going on what's on their minds. And so I think that that's a really key part of our work too, is connecting. We have a really large email base. We have a really large audience. And so being able to connect that audience to the folks who can make decisions is really important for us. So we always encourage our supporters to make their voices heard, because legislators will tell you that they don't hear from their constituents very often. So that's something that we always try to provide folks an opportunity to do. We try to do, pre-filled like emails if they need them, try to help them formulate testimony, all of those things in order for people to be really well equipped to talk about the issue of gun violence and exactly what can be done about it. So as an organization, I think if you, I can drop our website in the chat for you all, but if you want to do some additional research around some of the things that we've done in the past. I will also say that our executive director, Jerry, is on the call too. So she may or may not have some things to add to that part, but yeah, I think WAVE as an organization has definitely been able to accomplish a lot, especially because when it was first started, it was the only grassroots organization dedicated to preventing gun violence in Wisconsin at the time. So we've made a ton of strides, and I think that's why we're still going pretty strong today.
Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely.
Annette?
We have a couple more, oh, I was gonna say, a couple more people hands raised. Annette?
Hi, I'm Annette, and I want to thank Deja and Tim so much for speaking today. I'm extremely informational, and your stories and connecting with each other and how we can get involved. And your slides, I took photographs of several I'm going to share with my family. But my question is, from my own experience in the past, having done OEC, outdoor emergency care for 15 years, I'm particularly interested in first respondent and emergency care for EMT, et cetera. And I know that I looked at a program in Oregon where they work with EMTs or first responders, work with the police, and they send out along with the police. I think it's equal. I'm not sure. It's a community and it's been working. What is being done in Chicago or Milwaukee or other cities? Are we moving forward with that kind of response and respondent to situations that don't require police intervention, but that should be assessed and then have the right response taken? Can either of you answer that and inform us or me what's being done, so I can take a look at other cities or what we're doing in Milwaukee or Chicago?
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. And this is definitely, this co-responder model or alternative responder model is definitely one that is getting a lot of attention, rightfully so, for many of the reasons you just mentioned. A couple of things have happened in the last 2 years. Post the George Floyd murder in Minnesota, they had a very robust police reform debate there. And a key question that emerged in that debate is, well, when should there be an alternative response, or when should there be a co-responder, depending on the types of cases that police have been responding to? I think that debate showed where there is going to be some policy efforts over the course of the next year across many other states. There were many who were trying to make that required. They were trying to mandate that communities develop those models. And for a variety of reasons, when that final legislation was done, the mandate was not included. There was a very strong incentive for communities to do it, because at the moment there is an enormous funding gap to stand that up immediately. And so I think what we're seeing happen is some incentives being set up by states. We're starting to see the feds dedicate some of the ARP stimulus dollars that I talked about earlier. They are setting aside some money to fund some pilot programs that should be funded within the next year or so. In Chicago and in many other cities, individual cities are applying some of those ARP dollars to types of those co-responder models. We just committed our own grant dollars to evaluate the program that is being established, like as we sit here today, here in Chicago. And so we don't have an experience to be able to share at this moment. But I think what you're putting your finger on, though, is an area that people are spending a lot of time, money, and effort trying to develop exactly those programs. And I think if we have this conversation a year from now, we'll have a very long roster of examples that you can point to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Jack, please. Jack Murtaugh.
Thank you. I certainly appreciated the presentations and the concreteness of what was shared by both of our presenters. Tim did mention that politically, we're at a different point than we have been somewhat in the past because of the policy control policies that are controlled by political parties, and some members of Congress or state legislatures will not vote for something unless their party supports it. But concretely, again, how do neighborhoods how do people in neighborhoods take control of their neighborhood? For example, we always talk about block leaders working together. When we look at Chicago, Milwaukee, people outside of Chicago, outside of Milwaukee, say, oh, we're not going into that city because it's not safe. And in reality, as the statistics and slides showed, the issue of violence is very heavy in certain areas. Outside of those areas, domestic violence and suicide is also a reality. So the question I'm asking, in the midst of all the political fighting that goes on about what we can and cannot do, what can neighborhoods do? A person has a barbecue in their backyard. Can they say, no guns are allowed in this house? No guns are allowed in this backyard? Just as sometimes there used to be no smoking in this house. Can it get all the way down to the neighborhood reclaiming control of their neighborhood and their family life?
Thank you for the question, John. It's a really good one. I think that, first of all, when we think about the idea of when we say like our communities or their communities, I think that we also have to look at what that truly means. Like what does it mean for a community to belong to people? I know that in some communities, I've talked about this a little bit earlier, home ownership rates are extremely low. There are, specifically in Milwaukee, a lot of the people who own the majority of the property in Milwaukee do not live in Milwaukee. A lot of the businesses that have found themselves in Milwaukee are not owned by people who are living or based in Milwaukee. And so I think that is one issue that we have to work on addressing is actually when we say, how can people do things differently in their neighborhoods or in their communities, it's about actually making sure that they are living in their own neighborhoods and in their own communities by influencing this idea of home ownership and being able to allow people to come in and own things and have businesses and be successful and get the resources that they need. In addition, when you talk about this idea of it getting all the way down to a barbecue that you might be doing and setting some rules and parameters for your household, I think that it is one part of that is about just changing the narratives around guns. And as we mentioned before, it's really important to have conversations based on research. And it takes for organizations who do this work to get that research to folks, but have conversations based on research to let you know, again, that more guns don't make us safer. Lots of times when people have guns, they don't use it for the original intent for which they bought it. So there are a lot of different nuances of gun ownership that people just simply don't know. And so they aren't able to quite have those conversations, just yet when it comes to this idea of, no guns allowed or whatever that is. Also because of a lot of what you said about this issue of safety. A lot of people don't feel safe in certain instances, and they feel like, guns will keep them safe. And from our end, we know that that's just not, statistically proven that's not true, is that, additional guns keep people safe, but that's part of the narrative that has been spread around. And we have to do our best to dispel some of that. And then I quickly wanted to go back to Annette's question, just briefly to talk about first responders and some of the things that are going on in Milwaukee. So I just wanted to, again, mention the Office of Violence Prevention, their violence interruption program. They actually have hospital responders that have pagers where when incidents happen, and those hospital responders in the Office of Violence Prevention, they actually respond within 10 to 15 minutes of an incident happening. Another organization here is Safe and Sound. They have neighborhood safety coordinators who are also called to the scene as a form of a first responder to be actively involved in shooting incidents. Another thing that I've seen across the country is something called Stop the Bleed. And Stop the Bleed is a training program for citizens to be able to learn how to stop bleeding on gunshot wound victims. And so a lot of times the EMTs and the police, they don't get there right away, and people are standing there while somebody is actively bleeding. And so the Stop the Bleed campaign has been going across the country trying to teach people how to, since they're first on the scene, how to respond to that in a really safe way. So just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that too.
Thank you, Deja. I'm gonna call on Jerry, but I'm gonna tell George that he's next. Jerry.
Hi, thank you. So this question is for either of you or both. Back in maybe 2008, 2009, the executive vice president of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, came out and said, the guys with the guns make the rules. And in that moment, it felt more like, maybe like a lyric from a Johnny Cash song than a new way of life. But I am concerned over the ensuing years that the guys with the guns make the rules has kind of taken root, and we are seeing that more often. And what's really frightening is that judges are kind of coming down on that side. So I'm wondering if you can respond to kind of this, what we are seeing, the context of what we are seeing right now, and how we might push back against that narrative.
I mean, you put your finger on an enormous issue, and there's been a ton of coverage, I think, over the last month or two. Even since January 6th, talking, I think, about kind of the end of what you started here, which, there is this group of, armed, political extremists in many respects, militias and the sort. And they are becoming a barrier to the effective delivery of government. And they are, in so doing, they are asserting or insisting on their own, views, right? I know that may not seem directly on point to what you were describing about those who have, guns make the rules, but I think what they are trying to do is assert just that. They're trying to assert effectively their privilege and their views on everyone else. And we're seeing this now across multiple forms and levels of government, right? January 6th is the most high profile, in the country. But let's also look about the elections of 2020. And there was a widespread fear that folks with guns were going to show up to the polls and they were going to potentially intimidate people from showing up. There was high profile instances in the state of Michigan last year where, very large groups of armed individuals showed up to the state capitol and insisted that the COVID restrictions, be reversed and that the governor and other policymakers change course. And what is the impact of that, right? The impact is that policymakers are becoming chilled from acting. They are not able to make the best evidence, informed decisions on behalf of their constituency. It is preventing regular people from participating civically. Maybe they don't want to go and vote in person. Maybe they don't want to go testify at the state capitol. Maybe they don't want to go to a school board meeting because they are concerned about some of the activity that is happening there. And so until we get a handle on this escalating political, effectively, intimidation and violence that is in many ways tied to the gun rights movement and some of those that are within the gun rights movement, we're really going to have an increasing problem on that. What are the solutions? I mean, that's a great question, right? One, we're trying to support some research to understand, what those could be. Some of the policy solutions we believe include, enacting more restrictions on guns in sensitive places. Should you be able to have guns at the polls? Should you have guns in the state capitol? In our view, those are easy questions. In some places, they are harder questions. But we believe that there are many of these sensitive places that just shouldn't have access to firearms. We also need then to make sure that those that are working within government and within law enforcement also don't share these views. One of the things that concerned us was that there are at least 13 members of the Chicago Police Department that are current members of the Oath Keepers organization, right? Which is, an extremist, gun rights organization that believes that, government needs to uphold their oath to the Constitution and do XYZ terrible things. I'll spare you the details on that. But we need to make sure that government, in fact, is serving the public interest and that there are rules and regulations and policies and practices to ensure in hiring, in the staffing. I mean, there are individual things I think at the governmental policy and practice level that needs to be updated to prevent those internal insider threats from taking root.
Awesome.
I'll just respond really quickly, Dan. I'm sorry. So when we think about this idea of guys with the guns make the rules, I think it goes again back to the historical implications of gun ownership in this country. That when we talk about dismantling systems, at one point in our history, having a gun was a display of power, and it was so much so a display of power that if someone found out that you were concealing a gun and not actively showing it or wearing it on your body, that you were seen as a lesser person, and the people who were actively showing their guns were, powerful in that eye. So that's something that has actually been the case in our history. And so I also think that a lot of that has to do again with the gun culture of America. And when you look at countries who have gun rights and guns and things in their constitution, for some country, there are a lot of different countries that have constitutional documents. We are one of very few countries that have gun ownership and nearly no restrictions on gun ownership embedded in our constitution. So I think that it goes back to just the fact, again, going into history and trying to dismantle some of the narratives that we've allowed to perpetuate, for years, perpetuate our culture, for years and years. And so currently, obviously America, this is a democracy. So, gun guys, they may or may not think, and when I say gun guys, I mean the ones who are trying to intimidate people at the polls and trying to use their guns to intimidate people. They don't realize that we all hold the power. A gun may make you feel powerful, but by, way of living in a democracy, that is not the case. We all hold the power. And so I think it's just about being able to share that narrative and spread that narrative amongst people who really care about this issue.
Thank you. George? George?
Yes, hi, thanks. Deja makes some great points about how pervasive the gun culture is. And that's one thing that makes this such a tough nut to crack. This has been one of my key issues for a half a century. I spent the whole summer of 1968 working for federal gun legislation. It's part of the culture. I mean, think about the Lone Ranger, to which I listened to when I was a kid growing up. He was a vigilante. And so many of the superheroes are vigilantes, and many of them with guns. Prior to Law and Order, the television program, the longest running show on television was Gunsmoke with Matt Dillon, So we've got to combat the culture, and the only way we can do that, as far as I can see, is through education. And I think one aspect of this, which has not been utilized sufficiently, is the health aspect. We lose 100 people a day to gunshots, over 100, roughly a third to homicides, a third to suicides, more than a third to suicide, and a third to accidents, primarily with children. Education, if people realize the extent of the health aspect of the issue, and if they also realized, as Tim pointed out earlier, that if you have firearms in your home, they make you much less safe. If people realize that, maybe we'd get a more rational approach to this issue. So I would ask for Deja's comments on the educational and health aspects of this.
And thanks for the question, George. So I think it gets back again to this idea of actually something that Tim has been mentioning all along, is that research for gun violence has been underfunded for quite some time. And so trying to figure out where to start sometimes can get a little bit challenging, right? So we see that funding has started to be allocated, but because it is such a complex and nuanced issue, sometimes that funding may get funnel to one aspect of it. So maybe we're not researching the culture right now. Maybe we're researching, stamping, or we're researching ghost guns or 3D printed guns or something like that. And so I think that it really just has to be a situation where we're trying to figure out how to almost be like an octopus in a way, where we're able to do a bunch of different things at once, but also do those things with fidelity, like I mentioned earlier. And so I think when it comes to that educational piece and that educational aspect, I think we all, as especially as people who care deeply about the issue, have to really make sure that we're getting the research and getting the data, making sure that we're pushing for the research and pushing for the data, and then we'll be able to tackle some of the more nuanced parts of gun violence prevention, such as, again, that culture or this idea of this vigilante justice, as we've seen in Kenosha. There's just so many different aspects of it, and it takes a lot of time and money and dedication to really get into the weeds and with these issues. And so I think that those two things kind of go hand in hand, being able to get the research and the data, and then also being able to translate that research and data to pass it on to other people.
Okay, our last question. Last question goes to Annette.
Hi, again, thank you so much, Deja and Tim, for speaking today and all the discussion. And thank you, Dan. I was really struck by what Tim said about, I can't remember, 10 or 12, whatever, members of the Chicago police are members of the Oath Keepers. And then what really fries me is that these people that are infiltrated, I mean, that's a pretty strong word, but QAnon, and does our government, for example, does the Chicago Police Department and the board of whomever, how do they screen these people? And how do you get those people off the police force that are members of Oath Keepers? Because I think that's very scary and dangerous. And this is what happened in the last administration with all this infiltration stuff, with all this conspiracy stuff. But could you answer that? And also, Deja, if you feel you have some insight, I'd like to hear from you. And I know we're ending soon. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick comments on that. Number one, I think that state and local law enforcement agencies need to be pushed to develop internal practices and procedures to address this very question. I mean, in many respects, this is a little bit of a new phenomenon, right? The involvement of law enforcement in some of these groups, obviously you could go back decades, and I suspect we will have found parallels with other groups like the KKK and otherwise, but at least as it relates to some of these paramilitary organizations, this is a fairly recent phenomenon that has kind of re-emerged. And so these departments have not thought out and are not well equipped to put rules in place, and they're also constrained by constitutional rights too, right? And so these are tricky rules to put in place. So two things are underway. Number one, the Biden administration announced back in May that they are going to ramp up some additional support for federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to do better screening of individuals that are either currently on the force or are being hired. So you're going to get some support there that I think will get rolled out by the end of the year. I think the second thing is, more has to be done by the associations that support law enforcement to endorse and come up with these policies. We know that a lot are thinking about it. We just awarded a grant to develop some model policies that we think people could take. But what folks on the ground need to do is they need to demand that their local law enforcement agencies are coming up with those model policies. I think the other thing that you could do, separate aside from the law enforcement angle, is why some of these organizations are able to exist and to grow, is their ability to organize on various platforms that we all use, whether that be Facebook and Twitter and the sort. And there needs to be more pressure brought to bear to those platforms to be more responsible in how they are allowing their platforms to be used by these organizations. There is no question that Facebook was used as a central organizing point for the January 6th insurrection. Like, that is indisputable, right? But that also shouldn't be allowed, right? And they are as a private actor, and we believe that pressure from the community needs to be brought to bear on those platforms.
Thank you.
thank everyone. This morning has been a breathtakingly heavy content-oriented discussion. I'm so grateful for everybody's participation, particularly Deja and Tim. I guess the last thought is I like to think of one thought besides all the good content that Deja brought up, is the idea of fidelity, that is staying with it. I mean, it applies to us being good citizens and following through with these ideas and keeping up with it. So I'd like to tell it that. And I think that's it for the morning. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks so
At
much.
our next event in December 11th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great program. Thanks.
Great speakers. Yeah. Thanks for organizing this. Everybody that worked on it.
Yeah.
Especially Ian.
Excellent program. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything to say before we knock off here? All right. Thank you all for tuning in, and Martha for getting the Zoom to work so well.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Steve. Thank